Hey everyone, my name is Trymaine Lee, and I'm the host of the MSNBC podcast Into America. Welcome to NBCU Academy. Today we're going behind the story of the wildly popular Southlake, which hit #1 on the Apple charts. Our NBC News original podcast about race, education, and controversy in the town of Southlake, Texas. First, let's take you behind the scenes with our reporters Antonia Hylton and Mike Hixenbaugh.
Hey there, I'm Antonia Hylton and I'm a correspondent at NBC News, and today I'm in a booth at 30 Rock and I'm about to record one of the episodes of Southlake. I want to show you a little bit of our setup. Okay, so I'm on the 5th floor of 30 Rock, and this booth right here is where my side of Southlake is made. This is a small soundproofed booth where I come usually about once a week, and I work with a team here to make sure that all of the track for the episodes sounds good. This setup is pretty straightforward. This right here is a microphone, a pop filter, headphones that I can communicate with our audio engineer, and then right here you can see I have a computer up where my team helps make sure that every part of the episode sounds good, that I pronounce names right, and I also usually pull a script up here to make sure that I know what I'm saying. I'll brag a little bit. My space is a little more professional than what Mike gets at home in Houston.
Hey y'all, I'm Mike Hixenbaugh, national investigative reporter for NBC News on the digital desk and co-host of the podcast Southlake. I'm coming to you from my home office in Houston, Texas, where I'm based. And real quick, I'm gonna give you a tour of my very fancy recording studio. Just follow me over here. This is the door to the studio. Yeah, that's where I've been spending a lot of time for the last 5 months. I've got these two twin mattresses leaning up against each other and a pile of pillows behind the microphone to absorb the sound. Got my laptop connected through this recording gear and my microphone here. And as you can see, this is where I've been spending the last several months, crouching basically while recording tracks for this podcast. It's really glamorous work.
And joining us now is Antonia, Mike, and Reid Cherlin, the executive producer of Southlake. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Now, Mike and Antonia, I want to start with y'all here. You are reporters every single day and come across a number of great stories. But how did you know this one deserved the full treatment for this in-depth multi-part series?
So when we first started working on the Southlake story, it was last fall. And this whole idea of critical race theory being the political issue of 2021, that hadn't really started yet. But Antonia and I worked together to tell the story of how this town was going to war with itself over a school diversity plan. And we did a written story that appeared on NBCnews.com. Antonia made a piece for NBC Nightly News. I guess we kind of thought we were done, but what happened after was our email inbox is filled up with messages from people across the country, in towns in Connecticut and in California and in Texas and New York, all over, saying, hey, the story of what's happening in Southlake is happening in my town.
What we were hearing from people and starting to see in our reporting at that time is that in the months after George Floyd's murder in communities across the country, there had first been this wave of new efforts to find ways to talk about race and the history of systemic racism in schools, for teachers to find a way to help their students digest what they had seen transpire on the internet or in watching television. And in response to that, then there is a backlash. Parents start to see during the pandemic, as they're plugged into their students' remote learning opportunities, they start to see those discussions. They start to hear more about systemic racism. And in certain communities, often majority white parents were launching a response to this sort of educational movement around George Floyd and the summer of unrest that we all covered here. So that's what Mike and I were sort of tracking in those early days. And then we realized Southlake was sort of ground zero, because their fight had actually started in 2018 with the release of this viral N-word video, students chanting the N-word in the district. And so they are kind of like ground zero, and we get in there and we're able to use them to tell a story that is really a story of the rest of the country.
In journalism, we use a lot of wild terms like killing your babies, right? How did you decide what wasn't going to make it in the podcast? Because all that time, all the great sources and interviews, how did y'all decide what actually would end up in the piece? And this is for Mike and Antonia, but certainly Reid, as the EP of this, could speak to this. But Mike, why don't you pick up? Yeah.
I was going to say, I think Reid should answer because he is, one of his side main roles was killing the babies. That's his job.
Well,
let's roll with it.
Listen,
Murder babies.
I wear that as a badge of honor. I think one of the main roles of a producer, or in my case, an executive producer, is you have a little bit more distance from the story. And so the role is important because you're the one who can say, listen, I know you spent 6 hours with this person while she cried to you into the microphone. The way this episode is shaping up and the way we're editing this script, she may not be as relevant now. Maybe she goes in another episode. Maybe it's just the episode's too long. We're going to lose people's attention. There's a lot of considerations that go into it, and you have to be a killer about it. You really do.
Let's talk about all of this reporting and all of this footwork, on the ground in Texas. You all got some folks to really open up. And Antonia and Mike, I can't help but think about Robin Cornish, folks who have really gone through a lot in this community in ways that even after the cameras are gone and the microphones are gone, they're still carrying that with them. Talk about the trust building and getting these folks to open up about some of the toughest moments in their lives. Antonia?
Yeah, that was a hugely important part because it's not just Robin Cornish. We have students who open up about traumatic incidents when they were minors that happened to them in school. And building relationships with adults is very different than building relationships with young children who, when you're reporting on them, you also often have to build, not often, you always have to build a relationship with their parents and their family as well. So, behind every interview, there's a lot of conversations, relationship building going on there. And that can look like a couple different things. I mean, it can look like a series of phone calls where you get on the phone with this person, you talk to them about the story you're working on, and this is, just on background, you're kind of getting to know them. You let them know your history of reporting. I would show people the work that I had done so they could understand, I'm not just coming to Southlake because I saw, a viral video online. This is building on a body of work that I've shown I'm really dedicated to. And the same goes for Mike. And so, there's a process of building your credibility with people. There's a process of making sure that they know that you see them as the full human that they are, flaws, accomplishments, and all. And, that after phone calls, it looked like also going to Southlake, going into people's living rooms, eating lunch with them and talking to them, talking to their kids. Those things may sound really basic, but often when people are about to open up about something extremely painful in their lives, or, in Robin's case, people have kind of dragged her through the mud in Southlake and exposed her family's financial history. A lot of people wouldn't want to talk about that and put their face on the front of an, NBC News national podcast. But when you really show people that you care, that you're here to tell the whole story, and that you're going to come down, in my case, fly from New York to Texas to meet with them and to understand them, that goes a really long way.
Reid, when I hear Mike and Antonia talk about this kind of the pas de deux, right, the dance between reporter and source and all that moving around you have to do, I can only imagine as an executive, this was a highly controversial, kind of highly charged case that divided the town. How do you balance concern about any wild response from those who don't agree with the reporting and the desire to really create solid journalism and to tell the story in as full breadth as possible?
This larger conversation we're having about race in this country presents some unique challenges when it comes to reporting, because some basic journalistic orthodoxies in terms of we always tell both sides of the story or we give equal weight to both sides, that gets really challenged and problematized when it comes to behavior where people are being discriminated against or seem to be being discriminated against because of their race. And that definitely came into play here. We wanted to tell both sides of this story. We wanted to be honest about what we were seeing. In this case, we had a particular challenge in that some of the folks in town decided they didn't want to participate in the story. Some of the leaders opposed to the diversity plan in town that around which the podcast revolves decided they didn't want to talk. And it really fell to us to try to represent them for them and say, okay, this person doesn't want to be on the podcast. He's made it perfectly clear he thinks this podcast is junk. And a lot of these folks got really personal and ad hominem about Mike and Antonia. we still want to say what this guy has to say or what this person has to say.
Before we go, I love practical tools and news you can actually use. So kind of a lightning round, each of you. One good tip for those out there watching right now who want to make this kind of journalistic podcast. One tip. Mike, let's start with you.
I think the most important thing is to think about, as you're setting out to tell a story like this, is do you have interesting people to wrap a story around, who can tell the story in an eloquent way? Is there a narrative arc? Is there kind of what's the ending of this story? I think a lot of times people launch into major projects without knowing the answers to those questions, and for an audio, immersive radio kind of storytelling, that's going to be, you're asking people to listen not just this week, but the week after, the week after, the week after. You need to have a compelling story. In some ways, you have to kind of think, like old school magazine writer, or you're writing in and looking for moments of tension, and you're looking for moments of surprise. And if you're not seeing those moments in your early reporting, then you might have the wrong story.
My advice would be to be ready to record at all times with whatever tools you have on hand. That was definitely a lesson learned in this series, and not just me and Mike and Franny being ready to record in the field at all times, but actually many of our interviewees are young, like Gen Zers, who were ready themselves to record at all times and happened to take videos out at rallies or record their principal, in conversation with them. And those are the moments that made this series. So if you're a young reporter who wants to tell really in-depth stories, be ready to record at all times, because that can be the game-changing material for your story.
Reid, one tip.
Yeah, so as someone who gets pitched a lot, one thing I find myself saying is something that editors used to say to me all the time in response to pitches, which is, that's a topic, not a story. And it gets to what Mike was saying, which was, okay, you want to make a podcast, you need characters and you need conflict. So we need characters who are doing something, who are fighting against something. But that's not enough. We need to know where it goes, where we want to take the listener. And I think in a podcast like this, particularly in a kind of a news environment, we need to know, how does this fit into what other people are experiencing? If it's a murder mystery, that's fine. It can just be about the town and about solving the murder. If it's not a murder mystery, it's got to relate to everybody's experience in a way that they understand why they're listening, why they want to commit that 5 hours. But you don't want to broaden it so much that you cheapen or dilute the experience of the people who are actually acting it out for us. So I think Southlake presents a pretty good model of how you take a narrow story happening to a narrow set of people, and we actually made it even narrower, and use it to represent something bigger, which in this case is the fight over so-called critical race theory in schools in the U.S.
Antonia, Mike, Reid, this was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for Southlake, an amazing piece of journalism. Really appreciate it.
Trymaine.
Thank you. Thanks for all of your support, Trymaine.
Thank you.
You can catch Southlake wherever you get your podcasts. It was an amazing work of journalism. I surely recommend it. Make sure you check it out. And also tune in and check out my podcast, Into America, every Thursday morning. And for more free lessons and behind the story videos on how we cover the news, check out NBCUacademy.com. That's NBCUacademy.com. For NBCU Academy, I'm Trymaine Lee. Thanks for watching.